No, it's pretty funny to be up front here with Larry because, you know, I started off as a food runner with Larry in Rubicon in '96, and if someone told me that we'd be standing here and talking about Red Burgundy, I'd be like, you're crazy. And then if someone told me that you have vineyards right next to each other in Oregon, I'll say, you're crazy. So it's been an amazing ride, and when James emailed me and said, you're gonna talk about Burgundy with Larry Stone, I'm like 100% in. It's like, we haven't done this in many years, so we might fight a little bit up here, so do forgive us. But it's discuss. So, you know, it's pretty amazing to be here, Larry. So take it away, Larry.
Okay, here we go. So back in the Middle Ages, the Dukes of Burgundy appreciated the lively temperament, and they took in the Côte de Beaune, it was all red, pretty much. Even in my lifetime, when I started, there was a lot of red wine from the Côte de Beaune. Chassagne was you could buy as much red as you wanted, more than you ever wanted, actually, and. All of Côte d'Or, they talked about the Vin de Beaune, even though it's the Côte de Beaune today, and it's still the cultural center of Burgundy. And it wasn't until 1936 that this whole classification system really got going in Burgundy. And it wasn't really until the 30s that en masse people started selling wine commercially. People did have domain bottled wines earlier. There still are. We can go back. Raj has had wines from certain estates going back that they kept mainly for themselves, or had a small commercial market for it within France and locally in the 1860s. It was pretty much not until the 1860s there was a lot of stuff that was sold in bottle at all. So this is all recent, right? The world is 3 billion years old, and history of man is 10,000, for winemaking is about 10,000 years old, nine and a half at least. And only in the last 150 years have people been trading wines like this in bottle. So between, what we're talking about is in the Côte de Beaune part, we're talking about Lodois-Serigny and Marange. So we're going to cover pretty much the whole area from Aloxe, which is just next to Lodois, all the way down to Marange. And then we'll talk a little bit about the Côte Chalonnaise. We had a little discussion earlier. I wanted to include, because it was value, the idea that really struck me, because I'm all about value. I don't have the budget Raj does, so I have to, I don't hang around with his friends. And so I have to drink value. I drink a lot of Bourgogne Rouge, I drink a lot of Passe-Tout-Grains, I drink a lot of really great wines that are not expensive from great producers. But I also love the Côte de Nuit, so I'll mention that right now because we're not talking about anything from the Côte de Nuit. But Côte de Nuit Village, unlike Côte de Beaune Village, which has many villages, it can include almost anything. This Côte de Nuit are basically two villages, Courgonlois and Comblanchien, and there's some really good producers. I'll recommend Fornerol, which is available in the U.S. now, right? And a good friend of us, Jean-Pierre Desmet, makes it with Fornerol. Fantastic vineyards. If you like mineral, if you want terroir, the soils of Courgonlois and Comblanchien are basically marble quarries. So they're that's what you see on the road. You see the marble business, not the vineyards, when you drive through those. Anyway, so the vines flourish. It's 400 feet above sea level. And the Haute Côte de Beaune, we don't have a Haute Côte de Beaune today, but those can be great values depending on where they are. So look at those, because there are lots of, if you've ever gone up in the Haute Côte, if any of you have gone to Burgundy and gotten away from the Grand Cru vineyards, you go up in the hills, they're very steep. And I'm a cyclist, so I like the bike, and I can tell you there's some hills that are really challenging, more than 20% slopes. And so if you're on the wrong side of that, if you're on the west-facing side of that, it's not so good. But if you're on the east-facing side, it's pretty good. And it also can be very minerally depending on where you are. Really interesting terroir. So I'm just mentioning this. There's so many. These are all. Look at all the Premier Cru, and the Côte de Beaune Village is only red. So if you see Côte de Beaune Village, it could come from anywhere basically, but it's red from any of those communes. Unlike the Côte de Nuit Village, which is really only two. So, but. That includes, when you look at the Régional down there, Bourgogne Ligoté, Bourgogne Passe-Tout-Grains, and it can be spelled as one word or three words, or as a singular or as a plural. It's the same. It's all permitted. Coteau Bourguignon, which I hardly ever seen. Have you seen Coteau?
Recently, there's been a lot because they're buying grapes from Gamay from the Southern Appalachians and blending it something more accessible, and it's seen them more in the last probably 3 years than, it's newer appellation.
Yeah, I haven't seen them yet, so, but it probably will be coming to the country because of the high price of anything that's red, white or red, depending on the communes. All right, so we're going to talk about the first wine. So Actually, in this case, we have the Lafarge Passe-Tout-Grains, but I'll talk in general about Passe-Tout-Grains. It's not terroir-oriented, but varietally defined. It's unusual for an appellation, and it has to be red, or it can be red or rosé. Has anyone seen a rosé Passe-Tout-Grains out there? I haven't. It's permitted to be rosé, just saying. It's possible. Some things are possible, but not done. But it's defined as a minimum of 30% Pinot and 15 Gamay. So it has to be, you know, by law, at least has to be 30% Pinot, but the 15 Gamay is kind of, it has to be minimum 15. It's usually 65, 70%. You know, it has to be at least 30, it can be 30% Pinot. It can be 50-50. It can be whatever, but a lot of them do more Gamay because it is less expensive. And you added some comment about that this morning because they can make Passe-Tout-Grains from...
Pretty much anywhere from south of Chablis all the way down to in the Beaujolais area, and a blend of... but Passe-Tout-Grains, I think that all these new, it's not a new appellation, but you see more of it now because global warming and things are ripening better because Gamay is a hard grape to ripen on limestone. It's more conducive to acidic soils like granite. So that's why a lot of the Gamay is blended in. There's some Gamay, 100% Gamay wines produced in Burgundy, but most of it is consumed in-house or it's used for the cellar workers, so it's not. So Passe-Tout-Grains is definitely something which you see a lot of, but this specific piece of land is pretty interesting because this is an old parcel planted in the 20s. There's a debate 26 or 28, but it's in the 20s. And it's just on the other side of the RN74. And that's, so it's co-planted Pinot Noir and Gamay and fermented together. And it's a classic Lafarge style. One of our favorite domains for sure. Of course, I had Lafarge first time with you, Larry, and Rubicon. And, you know, certified biodynamic, an amazing family. I think, Larry, you had Clotilde Lafarge work for you last year or 2 years ago?
Yeah, it was now it was 2 years ago. She spent 5 months with us in Oregon when we were making wine. She was just a volunteer worker. She was doing her foreign stage, her last one before her father called her in. But I actually got an email from her this morning about this too. And the reason it's called L'Exception is that her great-grandfather, Henri, when he planted this vineyard in 1928, quickly thereafter, he co-planted it. So it's both Pinot, it's a vineyard right on the highway, right outside on the border with Volnay and Meursault, and it's in Meursault on the just touching the border. It goes touching the border with in Meursault technically, and it's called L'Exception because in 1936 he was one of the early ones, but not the first one to mainly sell wine that's domain bottled. And the two wines he sold was a Premier Cru Volnay and Passe-Tout-Grains. And very few people, as Raj say, plant Gamay there, and he planted it in 28, and he liked it, and he planted it on this land. Of course, if you know, it's by the highway. It's not a village wine even. It's just a Bourgogne Rouge, but he put it there, and they like it, and they still have it there, co-planted. It's very old. It's Demeter certified. And interestingly enough, it's 100% destemmed, but that's basically Lafarge too. They're basically destemmed almost all the time. I don't know if they ever made a whole cluster wine in my history with them, and it's just lightly pressed. So it's very light. They're usually pretty light and nice. This is actually one of the darker versions, and it may be Clotilde, having worked in Oregon, coming in.
I think, and so 16 was, as you know, a difficult vintage, and you know, I thank Becky Wasserman Selections and David Smith to get us a number of these wines today, because when I got, decided on the wines, we were, I know the portfolio of Becky Wasserman really well, and one of the most amazing humans I know, so it was awesome to get the wines. But 16 was a tiny vintage. There was several spring frosts, and then right after that there was mildew in the vineyards, and then it had a nice summer, but it was a really rough start to the season, and nobody in the Côte d'Or got, everyone got frost. The northern communes, for example, like in Chablis, was devastated up to 90%. So 16 was definitely a tough growing season in the first part because it was really warm and dry spring, and it was 4 or 5 days of really cold weather, freezing temperature, and then So people lost up to 70, 80% in the Côte de Beaune. Got hit a lot. Also, of course, the top Gevrey got hit a lot, also in 16. So low yields, hence the darker wines, tiny quantities. So we have several 16s here, so it's an anomaly of a vintage. I think a vintage, the top producers, of course, as usual, produce wines of high quality, but it's a vintage, kind of tough to really kind of taste and see who produced great wines. Then you have followed by a very successful 17 and 18. So you've definitely seen this kind of swing of temperature in all over Burgundy, and I think the most successful regions in those vintages like 17, 18 are definitely the wines we're talking about today because of the nice, dry, sunny temperatures. You see good yields and wines full of fruit because I think this is a wine everyone can afford if you can find it. It's not much produced, but it's still a wine of great value and great pedigree.
Right. I guess we can move on. You can see it says 26 on there, but she sent me, Clotilde sent me information. It was planted in 28, so big deal, 2 years. But that it's on the Wasserman side is 26, but right from her, it was 28. Anyway, when it's that old, who knows for sure? They probably remember the first vintage that they sold was 34. Anyway, so we, talking about Passe-Tout-Grains before we go on. So the Côte Chalonnaise, as Raj said, you're getting Gamay from there. But then there are actually 3 Beaujolais villages that are technically in the Mâconnais as well. So there are sources down in the south again as you get into what's nearly Beaujolais or actually legally permitted to be alternatively Beaujolais. There's a lot of Gamay. And there are also, that's why I was saying, this was one thing we're discussing, whether or not we put a Côte Mâconnais reds in this seminar, but there's so few available. But Merlin makes a good one, I know it.
But it's called Bourgogne.
Yeah,
So
it's called
really,
Bourgogne, but it's not necessarily about appellation, and it could be regional as well. I mean, because we have a Bourgogne, we start with a Bourgogne Rouge. Passe-Tout-Grains. Anyway, okay. Côte de Beaune, Aloxe-Corton. So this is, we're getting to kind of like the famous thing. If you read this, you'll realize that those stories that I know are dear to Jim Clendenin, a good friend of ours, are not necessarily true. And it wasn't Hildegard, it was Luitgard, I don't know how you say it, who was the wife of Charlemagne. And but that didn't happen because the first recorded whites in the area were only planted in 1824. And it was by an ancestor of Bonneau de Martray. It was Bonneau-Berry, and they planted, it was first recorded like 1855, I guess 1855. And the earlier record that we have, 1824, it mentioned no whites at all. So in 1824, no whites. In 1855, we know Bonneau-Berry planted whites, so it's considered the first white on the hill, not going back 1,500 years or something. So that's why people think of Burgundy as white in parts of Burgundy, Côte de Beaune, but really it was red for the most part. And then, however, over time, whites became more popular, and some sites really are better for whites than reds, especially when you don't get as much direct sunlight from the east, and that's where you see most of the villages doing much better with white. So 1994 was, the declaration was for 100, and still today, there's 101 hectare Corton, if you just look at the Grand Cru, 101 hectare Corton red, and 49 hectare of Corton Charlemagne. So it's still only a third of white, even in the famous site that's selected primarily for
and a lot has been kind of changed from, pockets have been changed from white to red, red to white, because has anyone hiked up Corton? All right, there we go. It's an amazing hike because it's pretty steep. And when you start, so basically this, we didn't talk about Clos de Chapitre, is in the bottom of the village, just below the village. And if you walk up, it's not far from all the Grand Crus start right there of Corton. And if you're standing around the bottom where Clos de Chapitre is, which is kind of, if you go on a rainy day, it's hard to hike on rainy days, but that's when you see how much clay there is, because you see how sticky the clay is. In the bottom, there's quite a bit of clay, and as you hike on top, and you go on top of Perrier, and then you go on top of Corton, and if you come around to Corton Charlemagne, you just see how hard the ground is, even after rain. So basically, it's erosion. A lot of erosion, so all the topsoil clay comes to the bottom, and not many people have, there's a few domains who've kind of collected the clay and taken it back to the vineyard on top, but it's a lot of work, especially if you don't own the entire hill or hillside, so you can't do that. So erosion, so there's a lot of kind of eroded clay, and if you look at just the limestone, the chalk of Corton, it's very brittle. It's not like the same texture of limestone that is maybe in around Pouilly-Montrachet. It's very, very different. It's basically clay and limestone. It's almost separated through a line through Perrier, and this vineyard is in the bottom part. If you go on the top, it's much whiter soil and very brittle limestone, and that's where the white grapes are planted. And then in some cases, the whites have become red and reds become white over the years. But probably the longest aging wines, often described as bony in structure. Not this wine, but if you hit the hill of Corton, they have tannins which go straight and really kind of attack your palate. This wine is quite fleshy, and this is from Moret Blanc. So Pierre Moret, the family, this domain wine, this is a wine which is from grapes that are purchased because the estate of Pierre Moret is 100% from Banamaking Farm Vineyards. This is vines which they buy grapes. They think they make like 4 or 5 barrels of this wine. It's very small production. Also 15 vintage, kind of a warm, generous vintage. Kind of, I won't say easy drinking because it had a lot of backbone and tannin, but I'm always, impressed by having red wines from white wine producers, because Pierre Moret is known for white wines, had a long-term métillage with Dominique Lafont from Comte Lafont until 92. And then after that, when they lost a lot of the vineyards, they started acquiring some other vineyards for the domain and also for the négoce. So they make, I think, 4 or 5 reds, but mostly the wines they make are whites.
It says Moret.
It's Moret Blanc.
Moret Blanc, yeah. So there's no difference in Moret or Moret Blanc. Blanc is the wife's name, and the wife brought vineyards to the family. So some of them are hyphenated and some aren't. It's the same wine, basically. Also, I'll go back a little bit. So Raj talked about the limestone on top and the clay on the bottom. So there is a difference. You see in the clay, there's another influence besides the limestone, because the limestone tends to be whitish and the clay is reddish. So there's more iron in the soil, and it is deeper. And a lot of it also is the debris from the limestone. And it's a flaky form called lave, which it breaks up. And so it's, there's some gravels mixed in with it, so there's a lot of mixing of soils, and it's heavier soils, and almost always the better vineyard sites in Aloxe-Corton will be facing east. So if they face west, they're shaded in the mornings, especially the hills. If you go around the backside of Aloxe towards Pernan, it's quite shaded on that west side. So again, in Pernan, the vineyards that have a little bit of eastern exposure are usually a little better, or they ripen much later. And you have to have a warm year, which is happening more frequently, especially like this year. Has it cooled off? Do you know? I haven't.
Yeah, it's definitely, it's
still,
after 115.
Yeah, I hope so.
Cooled
Yeah.
off, yeah.
115 was the peak? Yeah. That's unbelievable. It's terrible. All right, anyway. So there are lots of wines. The wines of Corton, as Raj is saying, they're famous for being sturdier. They're always considered like the classic notes are sturdier, broad-shouldered, and this is a good example of it. And he's a great producer. He also worked at Leflaive. He was the grandfather, now I guess, of people running it was working at Leflaive for
20 years.
20 years, yeah, for quite a while. Anyway, so here we are, Côte de Beaune now. I think we're moving along pretty well, Côte de Beaune. So in the Savigny-lès-Beaune, you've got 2 basic splits. You have Bois Noël and Montpatois. These are divisions that are in there in the soil, in the exposure, and in the kind of, and so they supposedly make very different kinds of wines, and you can see in Savigny-lès-Beaune some really powerful wines, and you can see some wines that are very light. And Bois Noël faces south, and it comes around for Pernan-Bergerac, so it's Alosse and Pernan and Savigny-lès-Beaune, they're kind of touching in the south end of Aloxe-Corton and Pernan-Bergerac with Savigny, so you're already on the outskirts. But the difference is that you have this hill, this huge hill, which Raj talked about being hard to walk up. I biked up it a couple of times. It's a nice little ride, but you know, then you have the flatter areas that are sort of flatter. When you get to Beaune, it broadens out. And so depending on where you are, you have different soil types. The Bois is, you know, ferruginous, meaning it has a lot of iron. Oolites, just meaning egg-shaped rocks. So iron-rich, egg-shaped limestone, basically, at the top. And then you have the crumbly, like you see in Aloxe-Corton, and deeper clay and less stony. And then you have the Bonneau makes those lighter style. And then you have the Mont Batois on the Beaune side with sandy soils covered in limestone. Again, scree is just, it's decomposed limestone, solid limestone that was washed down over it. So you've got active limestone in it as well. And those seem to be more structured, gamey. You get some of the bigger wines from there. And then we have, as an example, we have Domaine Belen, which is all purchased. My winemaker, Thomas Sauve, worked with Nicolas Potel when he was...
Domaine.
So these are Domaine?
This is Domaine, yeah.
Oh, this is Domaine, okay. So these aren't purchased, they're Domaine. Anyway, he worked with Nicolas Potel when he was 14, 15, and he's still friends, and we go and visit. He was going to make wine in Oregon too, by the way.
Yeah, so this is a estate. So just a little background, if you don't know who Nicolas Potel is. His father was the great Gerard Potel from Domaine de la Pousse d'Or. Started Pousse d'Or in '64, and then finally sold the estate and passed away kind of in the same 96, 97. But one of the great domains of Burgundy, and the first vineyard, of course, was Pousse d'Or, which was called Pousse d'Or in the beginning, and when they took the domain over in '64, they had to rename the vineyard Pousse d'Or. And this vineyard, this Pousse d'Or vineyard, now called Pousse d'Or, in Volnay, was owned by Duval Blocher, who lived in Saint-Denis, who also at the time owned Romney-Conti, Clos de Tar, and a few other vineyards. So a very important person who took over. He was also Gerard Potel, Nicolas' father, also was a partner and trained Jacques Cesse, Domaine Dujac. So a very influential person, and some of the most elegant and age-worthy wines. And his thing was whole cluster. So it was a lot of whole clusters. If you smell this wine, this is the Savigny-Vivine from Nico. Nico's a dear friend and crazy guy, but the most amazing guy. And he makes a lot of wine. So this label, I mean, if you're interested on the way out, take a look at the bottle, because it has more information than any label I've ever seen. Like from the selection to the rootstock to the vinage to the soil, it's just GPS code exactly where the it's pretty amazing. And this is a property he bought, which is just in Beaune, where this picture is taken from. So, and he also has Maison Belen, which is he makes 100 wines probably from different appellations, all the way from Bourgogne to Montrachet. So really, a négociant in heart, but also, a domain. And he practiced organic forever, and like many people between 13 and 16, lost their certification. A lot of people did. Almost all of Burgundy did. Not everyone, but some people also almost went to jail because they didn't want to spray, because there was a lot of issues. So when this word you see here, Lutz Raisonné, basically is just conscientious farming, because a lot of people who had the certification lost it, and then he's trying to get it back again, and it's just the way it is. He is like, the way he makes the wine is like, he only does punch downs in the dark with candles and a lot of whole cluster. No, it's he's the guy, he thinks a lot about, different things which people don't think about, and age in old barrels. But I think Savigny-lès-Beaune today is one of the most important appellations for value. Some of them are getting a little more expensive, relative value compared to
This is Domaine. How much is that a bottle? Anybody have the price on that?
It's probably like $80 maybe.
Yeah, exactly. So value is... I buy his Negos wines. That's why I said I buy his Negos wine, which isn't as good as this, but it's a better value, but it's good. I haven't seen this label from his production with the GPS yet. That's relatively new, I believe. But his property is very good. If you can visit, it's right near the town, right in the town of Beaune, so it's easy to get to. And he did a great job in restoring it, and his coopery is wonderful. He's a great guy. But in any case, this is a much stronger wine, more sturdy than you'd normally see. And we have the vineyard source exactly for VA bean? It's just a
Yeah, it's right there.
Oh, I put it
it's
up there?
Vermont, the Champronnier, and Planchot. So
Oh, yeah,
he's
okay.
facing
Yeah,
vineyards.
Oh, yeah, it was
And
those three.
he does many different blends because he has very small parcels of. This is a total of just 1 hectare of the 3 parcels. So it's because he makes so many wines already. If he starts dividing every wine, he'll have 2-3 barrels of. He already makes like many wines in only 2 or 3 barrels. So.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful cellar. I think Savigny, of course, we have some of the great wines of, Bees, Patrick Bees, Simon Bees. That domain is pretty amazing. Also, there's Leroy has a Narbonton in Savigny. Of course, there's a newer little. It's mostly from grapes they purchased, but the farm is called Chantreve. One of my most favorite producers in Burgundy. Very special humans and just amazing farmers and amazing people. So we haven't had those wines, small quantities, but really good. I think Savigny does really well because it's east-facing. It's forgotten oftentimes because it's not Corton, it's not Ladois, Aloxe-Corton. It's not Beaune because Beaune has, I think it overachieves sometimes and underachieves most times. We have an interesting wine from Beaune here today to talk about, but I think Savigny is a very important appellation and sometimes gets lost also in a lineup because there's not that many domains that focus, except for Bees, that focus only on the wines of Savigny.
I prefer, that's my favorite producer in Savigny. And it's also relatively good value, but there's nothing that's really great value anymore. But the wines are terrific, and they have great farming and great winemaking. Probably many of you met Kisa, who's taken over. Patrick died tragically during harvest in 16, so his wife, I should say, has taken over, and now the next generation is working on it as well, being raised in it. So she's doing a great job. She's very sensitive. And you're not going to find much value from Leroy's wines from there at all, but they're great wines. So Savigny has a great range. There's also some lesser wines that are pretty good. And then we're already in Beaune because Savigny-lès-Beaune is just on the north side of Beaune, and here we are. And that was the center, the wine center, the vinous center of Burgundy has been Beaune, even though, and it was like the center for all the power for the church also was located down there in this very south end of the Côte de Nuit and both to the east and to the west between the Côte de Beaune and the Côte de Nuit. And Beaune was the center, of course, where they built the big Hospice de Beaune. And in 570, it was already covered in vines, so this way precedes the medieval history. And then you have early, at least it's early medieval, really early. And in 1395, already they were selecting that they would have only Pinot in the better sites rather than Gamay, which obviously if you're a farmer, you like something that produces a lot of crop, but he banned it. And then Charles XII built the walls. So if you're in Beaune, those walls you see weren't like 19th century, which is a lot of cities in the 18th and 19th built up their fortifications, but that was already done in the 15th century. It was completed. So when you're in Beaune, it's unique because the city has remained intact since the 15th century. And then you have in that area, so the limestone soils, again, going towards Savigny, you've got the limestone, thinner limestone soils making Mâconnais and Côte de Beaune Bressand on harder rock, and the wines usually need some time, like I think we see in the example from Savigny here itself. And then the center north, when you get to Grève, Toussaint, Terron, there's more gravels, and the wines are a little bit rounder and more medium weight, but they're very delicious, especially when they're younger. Actually with 4 or 5 years, they're really delicious already. And then when you go to Clos de Mouche, Vigne Franche, which I think Clos de Mouche is in the Vigne Franche, Clos d'Ursule, that's actually Clos d'Ursule, it's in the Vigne Franche. Anyway, the Cizy and Avaux, you've got really more, even harder and deeper limestone. So you have, as you go south, you have more clay, less gravel. They're deeper, and they produce a lot. Sometimes Epinot, Boucherotte, and Chouache, which I think Drouin has a Chouache or something. It's
Jadot.
Jadot. Yeah, that's right, Jadot. So there's at least 3 distinctive, almost 4 distinctive areas within Beaune. So you have to know what you prefer, whether you want to drink it now or age it. And then here we have the Drouhin Bone Greve, so we'll see.
There's also some pockets of sand here, which is decomposed limestone, especially in the bottom part. Like Saint-Vigny is mostly sandy soils, and so wines are rounder, higher pH. But Bone Greve, as what greve is, the gravel, so you have that kind of chiseled, decomposed limestone mid-slope. And Beaune was, since it was the center of winemaking, all the cellars, I'm sure you guys have been to cellars below Beaune, you can get lost in Jadot or Bouchard or Drouhin, all the big negocios, they all had their cellars there. And so it was kind of, I mean, the quality of the vineyard work in the mid-1900s and then all the way to now was good. It never overachieved because it was a lineup. It was like they had some Beaune wines along with all the Premier Cru and Grand Cru, the top wines. So it never really got a huge reputation. And now you have several producers. I think one of the most important young producers in the region is David Croix, Domaine de Croix, focusing on the wines of Beaune and really kind of making wines in a hands-off approach and making delicious wines. This wine specifically, I wanted to kind of touch on a larger producer, but a domain wine. So like Bouchard and Jadot, Drouhin, they of course buy lots of grapes, either in juice or in grapes or in wine. In this case, this is owned by them. It's a domain wine. So you can look at the label of Drouhin or Jadot. Bouchard doesn't really mention if they own the vineyard on the label specifically, but Drouhin always has domain on the label. It's very important to realize that they make great wines from many places, but their own vineyards are superior. They're kind of farmed by them, very conscientious family, one of the oldest families who are making high quality wines for many, many years. And this is an example of a wine. I was told that there's a lot of bottle variation in this batch of 11s. So just FYI. 11 is a vintage which is, I was there for the harvest, beginning of the harvest, because our harvest was late in 11. It was kind of very uneven vintage. It was kind of cold, and then it got wet, and then it got warm. I remember picking around the end of August in the Côte de Beaune into the beginning of September. It was very muggy, and there was a lot of rot potential. So people picked and chaptalized pretty heavily in 11. I think the whites are really terrific, and the reds are round and soft and delicious. This wine, I think, it shows that. In vintages in Burgundy, some vintages really show the place, the terroir. Some vintages show the sun or the style of the wine. This is a vintage like that because it doesn't show that same brittle character which this wine would have. With Bone Greve is always kind of brittle and chalky on the palate. This wine is quite round and quite.
I find it a little chalky.
Yeah.
I think there's some chalk in the finish, but I think it actually is interesting because whether the variation is the result of the winemaking. I think it could be shipping. The problem that we have in the U.S. still to this day is that wines get mishandled a little bit sometimes. And I'm not saying you can't tell where along the chain it may have happened. There may have been some heat exposure or something. But because when you have these wines in Burgundy, they taste very different. So you have to go, what's the difference? It's the shipping. And they used to say, oh, some wines don't travel well. That's because they were subjected to containers that weren't refrigerated, and they'd get to the U.S. and they were cooked already. But we don't have that so much today. But even in my lifetime, through the 90s, it was a big problem. It has only really changed, and through the 90s, it got better and better, but it was still pretty bad. When we had Rubicon, I got a shipment of wine where the corks were all pushed. It was like Lefebvre. I hate to say it was Lefebvre, and the corks were pushed out, and they were all leaking because it had come through Kansas in August and in a non-refrigerated truck. They said, well, it was insulated. I go like, yeah, it left New Jersey, and it was coming to San Francisco. How long did that last in 100-degree weather? Anyway, so it's hard to say why, but there's some variation usually in wines. A lot of it has to do with shipping. Again, Drouhin was one of the great negocios, and these are domain bottle, which is lovely. They do, their protocols are up there. They do basically, what's pretty standard for this.
Yeah, it wasn't easy to get. They make a lot of wine, and it's a lot of different wines, and. But this is a general what the estate does.
Yeah, and I was going to say it's all destemmed, which is we have a lot of destemmed wines
yeah,
here
no,
today.
it's I mean it's percentage. You know, we're gonna have the whole cluster coming up. It's coming.
I know. Okay, we have this little discussion going on for like 20 years about whole cluster versus destemmed. I play both sides. I don't care, but he's very much on the whole cluster side. So, but you can have great wines that aren't. So Pommard, again, now a bigger area, famous name because I think it's easier to say for most English speakers, and they make very sturdy wines. They talk about Corton being some of the sturdiest, but Pommard, a Pommard can be pretty tough. However, when I look at the wine we have, I'm not so sure. It seems to be one of the more delicate ones. It's divided by the Dune River, flowing from Nantou, which is where I had a nice bike accident once. It's the steep hills coming down into Pommard. And then on the Beaune side, there's the stony white marl at the top, and it gets redder and less stony when you get towards the mid-slope. And you have argilière, which you can see must have gravel in there, or sand, I should say sand, argile. And Charmeau, not Charmois. And then Volnay, you have steeper, rockier, and redder soils, like Rougien, one of the most famous sites. And you have different limestones. So any of you are geologists, you can tell me the difference between Argovian and, maybe you can, you wrote the book, Argovian and Oxfordian limestone, but you find those themes here throughout the soils, Oxfordian versus Argovian, mainly Argovian. They're just from different deposits, different seabed deposits at different times. And then you have Fremier, Poutour, and Bertin, Croix Noir. I don't think we see those names that often here. We tend to see Rougien, quite a bit, Epinote from the other side, and then you have, high electroconductivity. This is something that I looked at, and I go, that's great, high electroconductivity between the clays and the limestone. So that actually is very important for fertility and for complexity in wine. When you have high electroconductivity in a soil, combined with a certain kind of water retention that you find in limestone or in certain volcanic soils, you get really interesting flavors. And so in the Fremier and Poutour, Bertin, you see some of the richest, sturdiest, maybe even more rustic in some cases, depending on the winemaking, wines from Pommard.
Yeah. Well, here we have a whole cluster wine, Larry.
Yeah, whole cluster. Okay. Pacalais.
All right, Larry.
You talk.
Yes, I will speak. He's a dear friend. It's, some people love his wines and some don't. Me and Larry had a late night discussion about Philippe.
I like the wines.
Okay, that's fine, Larry.
I like the wines.
It's all good. So 17 vintage, generous vintage, and Pacalais style. So Pacalais is, he's a nephew of Marcel Lapierre, who is, fair to say, he's the father or grandfather, what you can call him, of natural wine. So that's how Philippe learned. And Philippe, when he left Beaujolais, and he worked at Domaine Prieurroch, which is another, and he converted the vines and the winemaking in this style of whole cluster, farming organic, biodynamic, and really kind of making wines with, not carbonic, but all whole cluster, and especially a wine of a technique. So this is maybe not the most classic Pommard, because it depends where you're on Pommard. If you're on the Volnay side, the lighter soils, and if you're in the heart of Pommard, you get a lot of red soils. If you're on the bottom of Pommard, it gets very heavy clay, like Epinot. If you go to Epinot, it's nothing to do with the rest of Pommard, because it's such heavy soils, much tannic, and sometimes the wines are quite rustic. And not many people in Pommard make 100% whole cluster wine. The old Damonti wines were 100% whole cluster, but most of Pommard used to kind of destem. Even now, most producers are destemming, but Philippe Pacalais has a style of wine, and he makes it in that style. All his wines are made in that style. He doesn't own vines. He, in some cases, farms. Some cases oversees the farming. So it's a maison, and doesn't use new oak. All old barrels. Everything is done in wood fermenters. I think an important figure, kind of almost like ruffling some feathers. He's a very smart person and just truly a gourmand. And yeah, there we got to move fast. It's 15 minutes apparently.
All right. We have 15 minutes left?
But
no.
Yeah, 15 minutes.
Oh, yeah, okay. So anyway, Pakeley, actually, interestingly enough, we don't see it too much in Oregon. I think in California also it's pretty restricted.
Yeah, this is not a value.
Yeah, it's not a value, and it's very hard to get. I had it first in London because the agent is a sommelier, and she said my wines from Oregon reminded her of Pakeley, and I go, really? And she said, yeah, I'm the agent for Pakeley in the UK, and there was a wine on the list. If you go to London, go to Cabot, a nice restaurant run by sommeliers, and we tried it, and I go like, yeah, I can understand. So I like this wine a lot, and it was just the natural wine thing that I don't know how natural it is, but we won't talk about that because we don't have time. Well, let's move on.
No, hang on.
No, we have to go. You said we have to go.
He does add sulfur. He never says he doesn't. Only no sulfur during vinification.
That's right, okay.
Only sulfur at bottling. So
okay,
you can decide what you're going to call natural or not, but he's definitely on that side of the scale.
He's defending him, which is okay because, these things have a life of their own.
Larry.
All right, let's go on. We have Volnay. Let's do Volnay, okay. So anyway, I'm not going to go through that because if we only have 15 minutes left,
there's more wines coming behind this.
Yeah, so we have to get the wines out.
Yeah, the first flight, and then...
Yeah, all right. So anyway, Volnay, maybe a couple of words. Marquis d'Angerville was the first domain here in Volnay. He was the first domain in Burgundy to exclusively bottle a domain. And the reason was because he was boycotted by the négoce. Because in like 32 or so, they said, he was complaining about the fraud that was going on, and they said, okay, we're not going to buy from you, and they thought that would bankrupt them, and instead he went and he got 2 other growers to join him from different, his friends, and then they as a group decided not to sell to négoce ever again. So, and today, Guillaume is running it, but Jacques, the father, was my introduction to Burgundy, so there's a personal interest here, because in 1986, when I first went to Burgundy, I went to visit Jacques Angerville. It was one of the first places I went to. I loved it. And then he said, where else are you going? I said, I don't know. I'm just walking around the vineyards. I don't know anyone. I was a young sommelier from Seattle. And he goes, wait, let me call my friends, Tolo Bo. And he called all these people, and we went. I thought he was going to tell me where to go. He said, let's get in my car. And he spent all day with me driving around to his friends. And he actually said at the end of the day, I said, thank you so much. He said, I hardly ever get a chance to meet with my friends, so it was a great opportunity to go see them. So that's a little bit different than when you go to Burgundy today, I would think, because you can't even get an appointment anywhere. Okay, anyway, so it's a great town, a lot of great producers also, Dominique Lafon, the thing with, the Meursault, Volnay thing, we have vineyards in Meursault that are in the, politically in Meursault, but they're considered to be part of Volnay because they share so much similarity with the wines of Volnay, and Meursault is basically white today. Anyway, so let's move along. You want to talk about Rossignol?
Yeah, but just to touch on Volnay, one of the most important villages, really, not because of only for d'Angeville. You have De Monty, you have Pustor, the old Pustor. You have, and of course, you have Lafarge. So you have lots of important producers. You have their old wines. A lot of old school producers. It's a very small town. And you have 2 extreme vineyards. You have, if you see a Volnay Santano, much more powerful, much more intense and tannic, and you have Côte de Chêne, same kind of style. But if you come to the north side of the appellation, the wines are much more ethereal and much lighter textured wines. We found some, thanks to again David Smith and like he was in the selection. We got something from Nicolas Rossignol, 2014. Overlooked by many people. I think he is an amazing person. He makes amazing wine and has a great evolution from early days and all the way to now. The wines are much more elegant. He has a pretty amazing new cellar he's very proud of. Again, farming, top quality farming style, fully destemmed and very gentle extraction. 14 vintage, I think, a classic vintage. It was on the warmer side, but classic. The wines are sturdy. The wines are, what Burgundy should be. I think after 14, we see a very different part of Burgundy. 15, 16 low yield, 17, 18 warm vintages, 19 warm vintage. So we've seen what happened in Burgundy between, let's just take '08 till 14. 13 was an anomaly. '08, 13, both were kind of vintages picked in October. 14 picked in September. So now, you see more vintages picked in the early part of September, sometimes in August. So there's definitely a change in, we all know the change in the climate, but it's definitely, it affects places, the Côte de Beaune a lot. Volnay has the highest percentage of hail. It's just right in the middle. So when the storm comes from the south, it usually stops right around Pommard de Volnay and gets hit by hail severely. So, it's an important appellation, I think, to talk about because there's so many little plots. This is just a village wine. It's a blend of a few vineyards, and it's a village I love. I love the elegance I love, but it's not always light. It's sometimes everyone says, oh, it's always light. No, it's not always light. It can make very bony, sturdy wine. This wine has a lot of tannin in its mouth, and you can see, Volnay can be elegant, but can also be more kind of robust and rustic.
Yeah, and I think also here we see a little bit of the house style persisting from, going way back. Some of the first wines I bought from Burgundy that I could afford to put on a list were Rossignol. They seem to be pretty good value, and I'm not sure what they are today, but I'm sure nothing's really great value anymore. But it's but it's still relatively good. But they always were a little rustic in the tannin quality. Again, it's people think, oh, when they get tannin and stuff, it has to be whole cluster. But again, we're back to 100% destemmed, which is very much, it's more the rule in the Côte de Beaune in general, where you find wines that are not whole cluster versus the Côte de Nuit, where they retain the idea of whole cluster. Now, historically, to support a kind of a historic view, everything was whole cluster. They didn't have machines that could pick grapes off of stems and do destemmed. If you look at if you go to Cluny in Paris, the Musée de Cluny, and you have the tapestries, the lady with the unicorn. It's a beautiful, art treasure for the world. But there's also the tapestries all around the Madame à Licorne is about winemaking in Burgundy, because that's where the power for the Cluny, the Cluniac order came from. And you'll see what they're doing. They're just throwing whole clusters in tubs, and they're stomping around in the tubs. And that's the most natural fermentation possible. That kind of fermentation happened for millennia, long before there was even a written history, in prehistoric times when they dig up archaeological sites to see this whole cluster. Destemming became popular when you could actually have, either when you had a lot of labor that could do it by hand, but if you ever try to destem by hand, it takes a lot of time. So that's not a very good option. And so the machines were really developed after the First World War. It was really in this century we saw progressively people adopting to destem fruit because they thought they made the wines more delicate and light. But here you see, not necessarily so. If you work destemmed fruit, you're going to get tannin. You're going to have tannin if you have whole cluster or destemmed. You get a different quality of wine maybe, but sometimes it's hard to tell. People in blind tastings think they taste whole cluster, and it's actually destemmed. So. Be careful.
And also the density before phylloxera of the vines are much more denser. They were not arranged, and there were no tractors to go through. They were randomly, and so the yields were much smaller because there were more plants per hectare. Same thing with barrels. I mean, the reason the barrels, they all used big barrels back in the day, and then because Burgundy was landlocked. Until the trains came, they couldn't really move large barrels around, so then they became smaller barrels because most of it was either purchased by the négociant and many times sold directly to wine shops or wine bars, because back in the day, wine was served straight from the barrel.
All right, time's up.